So now what we're going to do first is have a little discussion among the panelists and interact and see if we can get some fireworks going there. And then what we're going to do is open it up to the audience. And we've got, it's now 10 after 10, where this session's supposed to end by 11 o'clock. So I think we have quite a bit of time here. And I guess what I've done here, and I'll try and help here with the panelists first, is they've all said a lot of very useful things and comments this morning, but I heard several themes here, and I'm going to just pick up where Pamela left off first. In terms of, let's call it the toolkit, the implementation tools, the incentives, the financial side of all this. And, you know, Leith and Pamela and others have talked about tax policy, about barriers that are in the way, about the practice of development charges and the limitations associated. Haven't heard about parks dedication bylaw requirements, but we heard about people burning down wood frame buildings and OBC changes needed, etc. So I wonder if we could just start with that in terms of what incentives, financial incentives to level the playing field, to make it neutral, as Pamela said. What's the list look like? What should we be doing that need to make a difference and that'll, in fact, allow the marketplace to respond to provide greater housing choice and achieve these goals faster? So you want to pick up where you left off, Pamela, and start that list growing?
Okay, well, the first thing that I always talk about is development charges, and I'm interested in this because it is the most malleable. Every municipality has to review their development charge every 5 years, and now we have the Development Charges Act review underway. So I think this is really a great place to start, because development charge has an immediate impact on decision-making with respect to the development community, as well as, you know, once those development charges are passed through, they're reflected in market prices, so they affect people's decision-making. And the situation now is, in most municipalities, there's no distinction, for example, between development on greenfield sites versus development on already urbanized land. And that, in most cases, tends to create a financial disincentive towards building on the already urbanized land. So you're reducing the supply and the demand, both in that location. So I sometimes provocatively say, rather than having places to grow, we should just put one paragraph in the Development Charges Act that says development charges should be based on true costs, as those vary, you know, by location and density. Those are the two most important factors, and that you could bring about a much more significant amount of change pretty immediately with those two, with that one change.
Okay.
I'll let Leith
say
why I'm wrong.
Actually, I agree with a lot of what you said, except that I don't know that you can ever find the true cost in development charges. We refer them to as a welcome to community blank charge. Growth pays for growth has become a mantra repeated by all politicians, which to me just means all new expenditures in a municipality must be paid by new people who live there. I find that quite immoral, actually. I think that the idea that new development pays for all new infrastructure that will be used by all future residents for 100 years on the back of people on their 5-year mortgage is an immoral position for a municipality to take. I think that there's enough money in this country, it's just going to the wrong places. And there's too much tax at the federal level that doesn't come back to the local level. Municipalities don't have the right tools to charge and pay for the things they need to do. They're using the tools they have, and so the development charge becomes it. We're averaging about $100,000 a door for municipal soft costs. Development charges, cash in lieu. In Toronto, we pay a permit on a daily basis for the right for a guy to sit on a crane. You know, there's a charge for everything. It's mostly hidden. It's mostly after the fact. But it doesn't matter to me whether we're building in Toronto or whether we're building in Oakville. The only difference is in Oakville, they like you to front-end it, and in Toronto, they get you in over time and all the permits and fees. But it still adds up to around $100,000. It just comes in different forms. You get Section 37 in Toronto that you don't get in the suburbs. Development charges, school boards are a flat rate. Doesn't matter whether you're building a 5,000 square foot house or a 400 square foot condo unit, the school board charge is the same. So, you know, the whole thing, I agree the review is quite timely. I would like them to tear it all up from federal level down and start again and get us some rental housing. Because I remember when we had, everybody knows Calthorpe. I forget his first name. Peter Calthorpe. So the province, I think, was engaging him to do some work in Langstaff Jail Farm area. You know, it was a transit-oriented development. I remember going to one of these panels to speak glowingly about the growth plan about 5 years ago, and I met Peter and was on a panel with him. And I said to him, it's interesting we don't have rental housing in this country. And he said, well, what do you mean you don't have rental housing? How can you do transit-oriented development without rental housing? That's all, you know, in the U.S., to build a transit line, somebody comes in and builds rental housing, you have immediate benefit. I said, well, we just don't have it, the tax regime. And he never did recover from that. He just didn't understand how that would work. Now, I gather he's still being paid fees, but
he's never come back.
It's just not going to work.
Okay, just before we jump in, on this federal tax policy, a lot of us in this room remember when there was a totally different federal tax policy. Capital cost allowance, all of the private sector rental housing built in the 60s by and large that we see, the green ones, the Cadillacs of the day and all that stuff, limited dividend programs, all those kinds of things were done away with when the condo market, you know, matured. And, you know, again, changing the federal tax policy as well as the DC's level playing field, to me, is part of this equation. So just want to throw that out for consideration. So, Larry, comments?
Just a couple of, I mean, I think the debate and the discussion about incentives or incentivizing, I don't even know if that's a word, incentivizing, Pam says it's a word,
Vote yes.
Incentivizing intensification is a really important debate to have, and how do we, or either not necessarily incentivizing, but removing disincentives is maybe a better way of putting it. What are those disincentives that we have in place that prohibit people who either in the industry or in the public sector that are really trying to move forward and establish the kind of development, particularly around major infrastructure investments? We've talked about it today, about how do we get the kind of development that we want around transit, for example. We're starting to make some progress in there, and we can talk, and Rob, I know, is just very, you know, the council just approved an LRT, and there's a lot of really good things that are going to happen around that LRT line in Waterloo. But we need to have the discussion about, you know, what are those barriers, what are those disincentives, and how can we actually get them. Having said that, there are a series of existing tools that are available that we can all start using. I would suggest that, you know, the development permit system, for example. Most of you, if you're planners in this room, you know about the development permit system. It is a very useful way in which you can start getting at how do you streamline the development process. And then Leith will tell me time and time again, you know, time is money. And, you know, if you talk about how long it takes you to get a development application through the process, you know, he tells me it's 10 years in some cases, which, quite frankly, is incredibly crazy. So how do we put in place, or how do we actually get organizations, municipalities, and others to start using some of the tools that are in the Planning Act and some of the tools that are in other pieces of legislation much more constructively and effectively? So that's part of the debate as well. How do we use what's available to us, as well as how do we identify those things that are in place that are preventing us from getting to where we want to go?
Okay, Rob, your turn.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm just going to build on those comments. Leith, I can't leave your comment alone about development charges. So let me just try to add a few more colors to the portrait.
I like mine.
I think one of the things that's incumbent on us, and we don't always do a good job at, is collecting the development charges and then connecting the dots to, so this is what we did with the development charges. So point to the bridge, point to the sewage treatment plant. You know, in our case, we're 550,000 people, but, you know, the 10-year program is pushing $2 billion. And that's a lot of money for us, and our year-over-year construction programs are very robust. So I would agree that you need rigidity and fairness in terms of collection, but as I said before, amendment to the Act, I think is timely. I think we're misaligned in terms of our vision and the financing tools. I'd add a couple things. Tax increment grants. we provide in the region with the cities of Cambridge and Kitchener. Because we have that industrial legacy, we have a rich legacy of contaminated sites as well. And that's about leveling the playing field. I'm a big fan of development permits. I would agree that zoning is a popular political tool, but I would commend the cities in our region for having got their act together in terms of pre-zoning. The one area that I continue to be focused on is density bonusing. I'm a believer in density bonusing when done right. I won't describe it as a barter economy, but it really is, in order to secure other public interests. I think there's a few other things. One of them, in terms of an incentive, is what I would call market intelligence. And Pamela used the term shift. We use that a lot in our region. Shifting away but not abandoning. So for example, the shift is to transit investment. We're not abandoning road investment. We spent about $250 million in the last 8 years on road improvements, and that's excluding road maintenance. And so we're making those shifts happening. We have a website called regionofwaterloo.ca/big shift, and we have a community building strategy, and that provides effectively free market intelligence. Urban Strategies and Colliers came together and did some work, and I consider that an incentive or a financing tool as well, because it allows those who don't know us to hit the ground running and to get a better sense of us from the outset. So just a few more examples, Paul, to round out the discussion.
Okay, thank you. I just want to throw one other thing in there, and maybe we get some further comment on this related to this. I'll give you one example. In the City of Toronto and elsewhere, development charges have been increased, and they continue to be increased at every opportunity. But one of the things that drives me insane is, in Toronto we have several priority neighborhoods, the so-called inner suburbs, in many cases that Leith referred to. Well, I've talked to many developers. They pay the exact same development charge to develop a Jane and Finch or Weston as they do in Yorkville. Well, guess what? Nothing happens. It just made it a lot worse in terms of the economic reality of it. And correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but my understanding, I believe, was that the City of Waterloo, in fact, to incent development of the downtown core, removed development charges in specific areas. I just wonder if we get some comments on that.
Yeah, that's correct. Indeed, it did. And we've got an interesting debate going on right now in the City of Kitchener as well. So just this week, Kitchener Council was just debating whether they remove that core area development charge. The outcome was that while they couldn't all agree and the exemption will remain in place, everyone has been put on notice that this is purportedly the last time that exemption is going to occur. I mean, there are great growth pressures in the core. There is great investment that's not captured for infrastructure. And but yeah, Paul, to your point, the City of Waterloo has removed its core area exemption already.
Okay, so there's a growing list here of things that perhaps you can add to as we get to the audience in a second. I think we have time for at least one more round with the panel here, and I'd like to suggest we talk a bit about the public choices, the marketplace, the choices, the consequence, the life cycle housing, the interrelationship of the jobs, the housing, and transportation, and how that might differ, obviously, inside the Greenbelt versus outside the Greenbelt. We've heard a lot about, not every place is the same. We all know that. And related to that, I think, is I hate this word, but the public education process, because, there's no question. All we can do as planners is provide advice, good policy, give people opportunities to make intelligent choices. And I wonder if we get some comments from the members of the panel on how that might be done an awful lot better. So anybody want to jump in first? Pamela?
Sure. I think one of the things about market that we probably don't understand as much as we should is how that market is going to be changing over time. Like, the market is a dynamic thing. It has to do with demographics and preferences and prices. And how is that changing over the term of the plan? Obviously, this is a long-term plan. Pembina's done some really interesting research that looks at preferences and shows a pretty significant shift in demand, that a lot more people want to live in walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods. And there is a kind of idea of a falling demand for the kind of classic auto-dependent suburb. You see travel data from the United States that shows for the first time, basically since the car was invented, since 2008, that the amount of total miles, vehicle miles traveled in the States has leveled off since 2008. People aren't willing to drive as much. And I think the younger generation as well are really more interested in riding their bikes and communicating by text or Instagram or whatever other thing that they've got going that I don't know about yet. So I think there is, this shift. Another interesting piece, and I don't know if it applies in the Canadian context, Chris Nelson in the United States has done a really interesting analysis of the demographic data and the housing supply there for metropolitan areas. And he has found that whereas the greatest proportion of the demand has been in the last maybe 30 years for, single-family houses for growing families, that over the next 30 years, that is going to basically reverse. And 72% of the demand for housing is going to be downsizing baby boomers and small starter households. And so that means that a huge supply of existing single-detached housing will become available within the existing stock. And that may be, I think we need to factor that into the equation when we're looking at, what is it exactly that we're planning for over the longer term, and I'm not sure that we've actually done that.
Okay, thanks. Leith?
Well, there's no question that demographically, younger people prefer not to be in the burbs, and they'd rather be downtown until they have kids, and then it starts to change. And then when the kids leave, they wish they didn't have the big house and they want to move back downtown. So we're seeing a lot more movement on a life cycle basis. I've always been intrigued by the cost of older homes in the city of Toronto. We always expected Cabbagetown, there are areas where downtown neighborhoods have had value, retained value. What's amazing to me is how much it's gone up. And I know that there's a fondness, especially at the federal level, to blame condominium housing for creating a bubble. I think that's bullshit. I think the bubble that doesn't really exist is all coming from the drag of cost of new housing. All housing in Toronto, to use an example, is based off the pricing of new housing. So if a new house with its $100,000 starting bill and then land costs going up and time to get it approved going up, if you're now looking at a $700,000 townhouse in Markham, suddenly that piece of junk in East Toronto, which is a semi that needs another $150,000 of improvement, looks like a good deal. But you got to buy it for $700,000. It still looks like you're getting more space and you're closer to because of the cost of the townhouse in Markham. So, developers have always, and builders have always looked at the cost of what's an existing house. We know our inputs are more. We have to charge more. Every time we charge more, it just creates this space for existing housing to float up quickly.
Okay. Larry?
First of all, let me thank Leif. I didn't know we were allowed to swear, so that's helpful.
I thought that made that clear. That was a requirement.
One of my experience in the growth plan so far is that, notwithstanding some of the demographic shifts and some of the challenges and changes that we're seeing out there are somewhat predictable or somewhat point us in a direction in residential development. What I think we need to also start thinking a little bit more about is equally the changes in employment and the changes in what's happening in the economy and how that is actually affecting some of the change. We are planning now 20, 25 years out in terms of what we anticipate our economy to look like, what we anticipate employers to look like. What are we anticipating the nature of jobs and businesses and employment in this geography? I think that's a heck of a hard thing to predict. I think that's a really challenging thing that we all struggle with. What our jobs going to look like in 20 years? Think back 20 years ago what we were all doing in our jobs. It was very, very different. The nature of work that we were doing was different, how we did it, and where we worked was very different. I would suggest to you that going forward, the next 20 years, it's going to be very, very different. So that, to me, is something that we need to give a great deal of attention, because out of that comes a lot of the residential stuff. As out of that comes is where young people want to work or live in order to work in these new types of jobs. To use the old adage, and I think it's true, we're not going to have Toyotas anymore. We're not going to have the kind of employment opportunities that we've seen in the past. The nature, it's a knowledge-based economy that we're moving towards. If you think about logistics and distribution, an entirely different format of how we're doing. So how do we plan for that, and how then do we plan for the related amenities and residential and urban form to support that changing economy? So part of me, and when I think about the growth plan, we did a pretty good job about looking at the employment lands and stuff. I think it's an area that we need to look a lot closer at. And I think we need to better understand, try to understand, whether it's a crystal ball or whether we can cobble together the kind of evidence base that understands what we're going to be looking like from an economy and jobs and employment perspective going forward, which we need to give a little bit more attention to, because I think it is a critical piece in the urban form, the residential stuff, the amenities, and transit and transportation, because there's lots of evidence out there that we haven't lined up transit and transportation really well with employment, right? Where do you want to have transit and transportation work for you? Let's think about the employment side of that as well.
You mean like actually orient transit to jobs rather than to votes?
Yes.
I think that's what he meant, yeah.
So that wasn't on for that. Okay.
Okay, Rob?
So Paul, I'm just going to build on that, just three sort of different observations. One is just based on experience this week. So our council trimmed some of our transit lines out to the suburbs, and I would bet you I've spent 15 hours dealing with 2 seniors buildings in the last week because of the hue and cry, and so that says big things to me. That really does speak to the dependence on the transit system, and just by extension, for those who don't know, we're realigning the entire conventional transit system to, of course, relate as efficiently as we can to the rapid transit system. So, to me, that's a very telling observation. The second thing that hasn't really been discussed is this whole notion of footloose capital. So we talk about the knowledge economy. Of course, we have 2 universities and the college. I would suggest to you that all capital can move. And unless we are this complete community, unless we resolve some of our issues, we're not going to be nimble in the global marketplace, and capital will move. And I think that is a provincial reality for us all. The third thing is, and just to Leith's comment about sort of housing for families, and in our community, I have to say the development industry is doing some really neat work around family housing. Everybody wants a piece of backyard, Leith. Everybody wants some ground-related housing. Mm-hmm. And there's some really interesting designs, some new plexes that are being contemplated within our central transit corridor, but not within the station areas, that really would provide that ground-related. So I see that both, Leith, as a challenge and an opportunity for us.
Yeah, I think that, I think Reed Heritage is one of the people doing one like that. I've talked to them, yep. And I think that Toronto suffers from a problem right now where every site, even if it's a mile from a subway stop, people think it's a high-rise site. Yep. So the land values are crazy. That's maybe a sign of how much people are buying into intensification, but there's this sort of over-enthusiastic view that our growth will be unending and condos will go on forever, and so we actually have a hard time finding sites at a price where we could build that innovative grade-related housing, because we know it's there. In Toronto, it's a bit perverse, to use your book title. We have a hard time landing sites where we could actually go build them. Maybe we should all move to Waterloo.
If I could just add one.
The question was?
It's okay. You got to have more growth in Waterloo.
Drive the land prices up, and then we can't build them.
Great.
I just have a couple of comments on this, and maybe given the time, we can then move to the audience here. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. In terms of the importance of transit, we've touched on it as it relates to the growth plan, as it relates to the funding tools, and especially to employment. I mean, roughly speaking, when Ann Golden and I were on the transit investment panel, one of the things that stood out, that most people know anyway, is that roughly, 4 times the ridership comes from employment as it does residential on transit. It goes without saying, you want to put the transit where the jobs are. Not only where they are today, there, by the way, is about 90 million square feet of office space in auto-dependent suburbs all throughout 905. But there's supposed to be, according to projections, another 100 million square feet in the whole region of office over the next 20, 30 years. Where is that going to go? If a lot of that ends up in the 905 region, by and large, and is not connected by a powerful, I'll call it a regional relief line, that not only just solves the Young Bloor mess, but connects the suburban and the urban office employment, we've got big trouble. So I think that's one thing we got to really get our act together on. Another thing related to the family housing, I just want to touch on. I always find developers do respond to the marketplace. If the market's there, they'll be pretty creative. And that's slowly, I see, starting to happen. One of the examples has been the development by Diamond Corp in Toronto. For the first time, it was in the Star last weekend, providing a fairly significant component of family, larger housing in an urban setting in the downtown, and providing a whole series of amenities in the complex and in the buildings for young kids, for families. So maybe there's some movement there. But my last little comment, I have to say this because this drives me crazy. This is the whole business of, removing barriers that we've touched on, what you can do to make things better, and how human nature gets into this equation and how people respond. I'm going to give you 2 examples of intensification projects that I think make total sense. Lower Ossington, known as Lower Oz, just north of Queen, and the former Lick's Hamburger place in Leith's neighborhood in the beach. They were proposed, God forbid, for 6 stories. 4-story base, retail at grade, top 2 floors setback. Massive, massive fights, objections you wouldn't believe. Ending up at OMB, predictable results. You know what happens? And I've seen that over and over and over again, all over this city. What happens is about 75% of the people that, in fact, oppose the projects in the neighborhood buy the units. And they move in. And they say, gee, this is pretty good. I didn't realize this. It's not what I thought at all. And it goes to one thing that Jane Jacobs told me a long, long time ago. She said, there's nothing like see, feel, touch. If you get buildings built that people can go to, experience, see, walk through, live in, the more of those that come on stream, the better you've got your opportunities for people to, in fact, say, gee, this is pretty darn good. And my very last comment is in terms of life cycle housing. Obviously, we all get older by a year, and we know what the demographics show here. And I think one of the most precious gifts you can give anybody is more time, as long as you're healthy. And the fact of the matter is, what we're finding now is because of the gridlock and the commute problems and the lack of transit investment and all the rest of it, you all know what the time equation is with commutes out to affordable housing. And so I did a little calculation when we were on the transit investment panel with the premier in terms of using the CAA automobile numbers for this region, what it costs to own and operate a car, a Toyota, in this region. Give or take $8,000 to $10,000 range per year, all in, all costs. And what you would spend on replacing that car over your working life, aside from the health issues, aside from the money issues, and looking at that as a equal a playing field, as Pamela says, to what it would cost, yes, for higher priced housing, much, much closer to the job location. So there's all these kind of personal choices that enter into it. And I think we have to do a better job explaining how all those pieces come together.